Up till now, we have created our counter app, all of it inside the app component. But the main advantage of creating a React app is that we can create several components which can communicate with each other. So let's go ahead and do one thing. We are going to leave the button, the increment button, inside the app component, but we are going to move the display of the counter into a separate component called display counter. So I'm going to go to components, I'm going to add a new file, and I will call it display counter.js. Again, if I want to create a component, I will go ahead and import React. I will also import component from React, and I can go ahead and create a component called display counter, extends component, and I can also say export default display counter. All right. Now, the one function that we must implement in a component is a render function. So let's go ahead and implement that. And I'm going to go ahead and simply return the name of this component, which is display counter. Let's go back to the app component. And what we're going to do is we're going to remove this h1 and replace it with the display counter component. So I'm going to say display counter. And you can see that now it displays display counter. And another thing to note is that we have automatically imported the display counter at the top. Okay. So now the question is, okay, the display counter is a separate component, it's a child component. We are incrementing the value. Well, how do we know that we are incrementing? Well, let's go ahead and press on the increment button. And right over here, right at the bottom, you should be able to see that the value is actually incrementing as soon as I click. But this value is not really getting displayed in the display counter component. How can we pass the value of the state down to the display counter component? Something should come over here that we covered earlier on when we were passing the name of the person and the age of the person. Yep, properties. So I'm going to go ahead and create a property, and I can call this property anything I want. So I'm just going to call it CTR. I don't want to call it exactly the same, the counter. I can call it name, I can call it CTR, I can call it anything I want. And the value that we're going to assign to this property will be this dot state dot, what do we want to pass to the display counter? The actual counter, right? So this dot state dot counter. Now, one thing that you will realize over here when you are using this tool, the dev tools, is you can see the app component, but you can also see the child component, which is display counter. So right now the app component is selected, and that's why you are looking at the properties and state of the app component. But let's go ahead and select display counter, and now you can see the properties of the display counter, which is one property called CTR, which we created right here. So that's why I'm saying that this is very important that you start using the React DevTools. It is going to give you an idea of what exactly is going on in your React application. So now we are 100% sure that we are passing the updated counter. Let's go ahead and click on the increment, and now you can see in the display counter props we are passing 100. And now, since we're 100% sure we're passing 100, all that is left is to just display the counter value. So I'll go to display counter, and instead of saying display counter over here, we are going to say this, because we want to access the properties, dot props. You can actually look at it over here, this dot props is coming, it's the props, dot CTR. Let's go ahead and save it. And you can see that now it's displaying 99. If I go ahead and increment it, you can see that the value it is displaying. So now we have moved the logic of display counter into a separate component called display counter, which is a child of app component. It is important that you understand that when we are passing values, if we have different components, the recommended approach is you pass the value down. So if this is your app component right here, you will pass the values down to the other components. And that's exactly what we are doing. We have the app component. We are passing the value down to the display counter component. So that's pretty much it. In the next videos, we are going to learn about different lifecycle events like component will mount, component did mount, and we are also going to learn about how we can fetch data from an outside third-party resource like some sort of a movies website or weather API, and then display it on our screen.